we've all, I think, introduced ourselves to one another now, hopefully, and we've got a lovely mixture. We have Philip from Canada with us, and obviously you guys from the Czech Republic, and Glenn from Norway and from Sweden, and Jonas Varhammar is going to be our guide this morning, and he works for the County Administrative Board here in Blekinge, so we're a bit envious of him actually, because I think this is the best patch in Sweden, we're not going to say that everywhere either, but and the plan for today is that we'll be here until around 12ish. Then we'll drive from here and do a very quick stop at a Viking burial site that's very close by, just because it's got nothing to do with trees, but you can't come to Blekinge and not see one of these burial sites. Then we'll drive another 10 minutes and stop at a supermarket where we can get lunch and supplies. Then we'll take a drive to a meadow this afternoon where there's a picnic place where we can have our lunch. Then we'll have a walk around there. We don't have any guides there, so we don't have any times that we have to keep. We've got some old pollards to look at there. And once we're finished there, we're going to drive up to where we're staying tonight, which is up in Kalmar, and that's about an hour's drive. So we have about an hour and a half of driving today, roughly. So half an hour to where we're going this afternoon. So take what you need with you until lunchtime from the cars, because we'll take a walk now.
The reserve consists of woodlands, of beech and oaks, and a lot of old trees, a lot of hollow oaks, and a lot of big trees. And it's very important for license, insects, and one of the most important area in South Sweden for some species, I will say, according to how many red-listed species there are, and in quite high numbers. So this is quite a unique area for biodiversity, and it's connected to the water because it's so close to the sea, and it's not so common in Sweden that we have so much woodlands of oak and beech so close to the sea, and the sea helps at the spring times to keep this area warmer rather than other areas, and that's probably one of the reasons for the biodiversity here. And also fungi, it's interesting. If you are interested to fungi, you will find some red-listed species here as well, though. So it consists of beech forest, oak forest, or semi-open oak areas, and also pastures, as you saw, wetlands on the way into this parking place, and also some islands with oak and beech forests. And the site was one of the sites in a big LIFE project in Sweden between 2016 and 2020 called Within the Gap. So that's why all these logos, as you will see, and signs and at me sometimes. And we did a lot of restoration work in this north part of Tromsø, and we are in the middle of the maps here now. So you came this road and passed through the reserve and parked the cars like that. So we are going to spending this next hours in this north part, and it's oak habitat, and also some other broadleaf trees here as well. So not just only oak, but mainly oak. And before the project started, this area was quite overgrown. The oak parts, the parts with a lot of oak was quite dense. So and the oaks didn't like it at all. It was too dark for them. So they were quite affected, and some oaks, old oaks as well, started to die a little bit, die off at least. So it was time to really do something to help the oaks here. So we did restoration work to cut a lot of trees, and it was so dense, so it was important not to do everything at one time. So we, at least 2 times we have been here to clear out the tree stands. 2017 and 2020. 2000. I think it was 2020, the last time. But the project also wanted to find out some new solutions for the name of the project. It's Life Within the Gap, and of course I had a question immediately. What gap? It's not so clear. It's not a good name in that way that it explained, but it's good that the question is arriving, because the gaps in this case is mainly in time, because the old oaks that still are here are in the main more or less in the same age. They are quite old, about 200, 300 years or maybe more, and the next generation of oaks is quite young, and it's problem for many of the insects that used the oaks, because the oaks must at least be 150 or 200 years to shoot these red-listed unique insects. So the insects, when the old oaks will die in the future, the 200, 300 years old oaks, the insects have no place to be, because the next generation of oaks are too young. So we try to figure out some solutions for the insects. So where can they be in this gap of time? So we have made some wood
wood boxes with
yeah,
wood mold in them.
wood one. And we also try to get good habitats at veterinized trees, and you will see both here later on. And we also thought one step more to think about, is there any regeneration of oaks, but it was mainly none. So we planted also oaks. So in about 150, 200 years, they will also be good habitats for many of these species. So we try to think a little bit longer than in other projects in Sweden, how to handle these habitats.
Height was also one of the reasons why I've been involved in the project with you guys, is because of the work that I've been doing with veteranizing trees and working with old trees, but particularly veteranizing. And in 2012 we set up a trial which is in Sweden and Norway and in England, and this is one of the sites where we did the work in 2012. And we'll go past some of those trees, and I think you'll be interested to look at them now. It's well, 11 years ago that the work was done. We did monitoring of those trees in 2020. We did some invertebrates in 2014, some traps put up here as well. So I think there's some interesting results to look at how the trees look after this length of time, and the lessons that we've learned about which of the techniques are really worth doing. One example of that is we did two of our techniques we did in 2012 were on branches. So large branches, large in the sense larger than 10 centimetres in diameter at the base of the branch. But what we saw from when we did the studies in 2020 were that these kind of dead branches were just as common on the control trees that we didn't do any treatment on. So, which I guess we probably knew, but it's always good to know for sure. So I think we kind of have felt that if we're going to do any veteranization work on branches, then you need to be really large branches, like 20, 25 centimetres. But when you start to get that size, the trees are already interesting. They've already perhaps started to develop hollows, and those trees we most definitely do not want to be doing any veteranization work on, because at the end of the day, nature is the best driver of these different features and habitats on old trees. Fungi are the crucial drivers rather than the chainsaw. So I think we're more certain of the fact that whilst the techniques work well in creating cavities, they're definitely not a replacement, they're a complement. And as Jonas has said, veteranization was part of the Bridging the Gap project as another one of the techniques. And I think we might call it first aid for saprosylic beetles, really. And the best thing would be if we didn't have to do it at all. So, but this is a great site, I think, because we chose it to be included in the trial because it's such a valuable site for saprosylic species. And I hope in the future, if we get some money, when we have a different government, probably, that we can actually start to look at what a difference it is in sites where we have a core of these species here, and we have some sites which we've done in the middle of arable fields, and to see if those ones, if there's any difference, which I expect there is, but it would still be interesting for us to do that. So we chose sites that we had a mixture of those kind of environments, and this is a real hot spot, and you've got a fantastic trip ahead of you looking at the hot spots for old trees in Sweden. We're Kalmar and Östergötland and up to Södermanland and Stockholm, so you will see the creme de la creme of the oak sites in Sweden on your journey. And we'll pass several of my babies, my veteranized trees along the way, but this is one of my favourite spots too, just because it feels like we find bats in the trees. We've found nearby these Edelguldbagge, what are they called? Help me out here. Norimus. In the what we call the bird boxes. They're not for birds, but you know that. So.
They don't fly very far in one go, but they can I mean, obviously
100
they
meters or something?
I think they can probably travel up to a kilometer or...
Okay, yeah. So it's quite necessary in a way to have a big area that is of the right type
and
of-
stepping stones between those areas.
And that's partly what these have been used for in some other of the sites within the project, and even out in other places, as Jona said, some of the private landowners are curious about these, or where it's golf courses, and doing them at, you know, distances from one another as well to expand the areas that might be suitable. And I think with many of these beetles, there's a kind of our understanding of their ecology is still somewhat limited. And we often, even if you have a PhD project, which might be 4 years, their life cycles might mean that it's only every 50 years that they decide to fly 10 kilometres, and all the other 49 years they travel 200 metres or go back to the same tree. So we can misunderstand as well the ecology. And I mean, the hermit beetle is a good example of that, which is a really well-studied species, certainly, you know, in many countries across Europe. And when they've had radio trackers on them, they've mostly, 98% of them have gone back to the same tree, the adults. And there's been 1 or 2 that have gone 150 metres. But that was under a 3-year field trial. But we know that they must be able to travel further, otherwise they would never have got to Sweden. So it's a question of, you know, maybe every 50 years. Maybe, I mean, if you live in an old tree that lives for 800 years, why do you need to fly anywhere? It's a stable habitat that is suitable for you for a long time. Of the tree, a piece of wood was removed. So it, like this kind of size piece of wood was removed, and the top was taken out, and it looks kind of like a fracture in the top, that it's broken off. And one of the reasons we took out the top in combination with this treatment was that I was very worried about torsional failure, that because we were taking a bloody big piece of wood out of the middle of the trunk, that the tree would go off. And in the Bridging the Gap, they've done this treatment, which we'll also see, I think, here, but with ring barking instead. And I think they've had some failures of trees. So I think there is some benefit in doing it this way, but it also feels like quite an intense piece of management. At the time, I had a sore stomach about this, that the trees would just all die. So we're seeing other kinds of microhabitats that are forming as a consequence. Some of these smell like an old drunk when you get up there, that it's just like, pwah, and it's the sap that's then fermenting inside the hollows. Others, we've got water that have drained and has sat in the bottom. Others are completely dry. So without realising it, just by doing things in a random way, this was set up as a scientific experiment. So we were very conscientious about, we selected the trees, but then which tree had which treatment was done randomly, which tree was a control was done randomly. Even the cardinal point on the tree that they were done was also done randomly. So it was all set up very much so that it could be followed up as a very long-term scientific study. And I mean, every time I come, it's like Christmas, I think, you know, put the ladder up and go up and you don't know what you're going to find inside these. And that's without even looking for the insect species, or without even looking for the fungal species, which requires, you know, other sorts of work. This is a woodpecker hole which we created and had almost closed over in 2020. And the woodpecker, I think, or if it's a squirrel, has opened it again. Yeah. And you can see also, this is here, these are all, they used climbing spikes to climb up the tree. We do all of them with climbing spikes because it's faster and safer. Yeah. And the damage, usually it's, when I'm here with them, when we did this particular, it's like you really need to go for it, you know, really damage the trees, which kind of goes against everything that you're taught as an arborist, when mostly you're only using climbing spikes when you're felling a tree. And to do it on a live tree intentionally, you're trying to do the least damage possible. So most of them ended up having to buy new climbing spikes because of the kind of the work that this did. But you can see here that you've got, these are probably, you know, it's created a seam of cambium here which has died back because it's flat on this surface. That in combination with the hole that was created up there. And you can see, I don't know if you can see if you've got binnies, but it's calloused really well. It's really flat, smooth callus. Yeah. And there's been a woodpecker or something else here opening up that hole again based on how it was 2020 when I was here last, so it's 3 years ago.
Great
Capricorn beetle.
Capricorn beetle. That is also in the project. It's we introduced here at Tomte at this site. So for 5 years we have put out insects here, originally from the island Öland and Halltorp, as you will visit tomorrow. And I think Jonas Hedin, my colleague in the county of Kalmar, will talk a lot about this one.
That's his baby.
Yeah, that's his baby. So we choose the 3 good, as we thought, good trees for this beetle, and we build temporary enclosures like voliere around the trees, and we put the insects inside the cage, and also we to really, they are not cheap, so we try to maximize the outcome of this. So we also feed them once a week. So that's why it's a small door, and you could put in bananas, and they really loved bananas.
They eat bananas.
Yeah, they eat bananas. And we put a female and male in the same voliere, and we hope with the bananas that they had enough strains so they could produce new beetles.
Wow.
We except from these trees with enclosures, we also put someone out in the free on good places, but it's because of the predations. Yeah, because they are quite big and quite easy to find for birds, so we don't want them to be eaten before they have done their job here. And it was quite dense here, and it was not so easy to find your way, actually, because you get a little bit lost here. It's hard to imagine now when you have a good view of the landscape around you, and it's not so hard to find the right way anymore.
We found just that particular species in a lot of the traps, both from Bridging the Gap veterinisation work and also from the work that we did. They seem to have done very well from our veterinisation work, because, and I think probably they were a species that were much more common in the past, but because of the lack of dead wood, and particularly this kind of exposed wood here. But what's interesting you can see is that often what we saw, I didn't expect this treatment to be quite as successful as it was, in that we saw this as a bit of a cheap, quick method that could be done by anyone. You didn't need a chainsaw to be a climbing arborist to do it. But I was inspired by, there's a site, Kinnekulle, which is in the west of Sweden, where there was a wood pasture with these kind of size trees in the middle with others, where the horses had damaged the trees, and they had the fistulina fruit bodies on them, on a lot of them. And that's what got me thinking that this could be, you know, if it's in an area where you already have the species. So that's where the horse damage came from. But also, of course, animals have always damaged the trunks of trees. So, and to have a treatment that we thought could be done easily by people and that was cheap. But what's interesting is probably, I think we had about a third have decay in them, which was almost as much as the ones where we created cavities. So that was really interesting, I think, for me. And you can see that here. Here there's decay. And mostly it's in this place here where the trunk meets the soil. And that was important. We made sure when you removed the bark that we went all the way down to the soil and used an axe if it was dangerous with a chainsaw. We had 5 groups of arborists in 3 different countries doing this work at the same time in a window of 5 weeks. So it had to be the same if it was going to have any credibility as well in terms of the evaluation work. So these were up to 1 metre in height and a third of the diameter of the trunk, and down to the contact with the soil was kind of the crucial aspect. These have also had the tree ants, and I think actually there's one posing for us there as we speak, that they seem to also be attracted to this particular type of habitat. And the reason I'm interested in the tree ants is because they are often associated with other insect species, plus they seem to be the kind of primary colonisers of these sorts of habitats. And I think there's a couple of papers that suggest they can bring with them mycelium of fungi as well. So there's I think, you know, seeing them moving in gives me some optimism for the other species coming in the future, I think. So.
It wasn't just grass that was cut for fodder, it was also leaves. And Vicky's going to talk more about the history with the trees and how they were managed. But as they were cut for leaf fodder, they were cut on a relatively quick rotation cycle, maybe 4 or 5 years, because otherwise the twigs grew too thick to eat. So it was a relatively short rotation cycle, which is different from, for example, Britain or otherwise other places in the European continent where pollarding was made for firewood, where they cut them on a longer cycle, maybe 15 years. Before the agricultural revolution, say late 1700s or early 1800s, you could only cultivate relatively small areas because the only fertilizer you had was the dung from your cows and sheep and horses. So the amount of meadow you had would decide how big areas you could actually cultivate. And the estimate is that during those days you had about 10 times as much meadows as you had plowed fields. And today, I mean, those meadows are nothing. We have maybe
0.001% is what there was, is the figure.
Exactly. But so the landscape in the 1700s would have been completely different compared to what we see today. It would have been an area with a lot of unfertilized meadows because you didn't have fertilizers to put on them. And the farmers probably would collect dung to use it for the fields later on, and also during the winter when the animals were put in stables because it was too cold, they collected the dung and then they could use that for the ploughed areas later in the year. Today, very little of this management is living because it's quite time consuming to cut hay, particularly with a scythe, and if you have, like here, very stony areas, you can't use a machine either. So today this area is grazed more than cut. I think there are small patches where they try to maintain the traditional management, but most of it is grazed. Well, not all year round, but all the grazing season, the whole of the grazing season. That, of course, has a different impact on the flora. These cut meadows had a fantastic flora. They were cut once a year and just grazed for a couple of weeks after the grass was cut, which meant that a lot of different types of plants could grow there. So if you were to do a vegetation survey and you put down a meter square, you would see probably 40, 45, 50 different species of plants in 1 square meter. And if you graze the area, it reduces to maybe half of that. So there was a driving force in the early conservation in Sweden to maintain cut meadows because they were so species rich, and that of course was reflected also in the insect fauna and the mushroom flora and all that sort of thing. And in a grazed meadow, obviously, as you can see here, you have much fewer plants that are flowering, which means less food for insects.
When I worked in England, I was responsible for a site with about 1,000 old pollards of different species, and the challenges of managing them when they haven't been pollarded for a long time. So in the UK, where I was working, they were managed for firewood, as Ola said. So when I first visited Sweden 20 years ago, the concept of the wooded meadow I'd seen in the northwest of England and in parts of Scotland as well, whereby this winter fodder, the leaf fodder, was so important. And we'd also read a piece of work, a PhD thesis by a Swedish guy who'd done a lot of work just on this leaf fodder production. But what kind of horrified me when I came here, and one of the reasons we came here is that it's a bit of a sad site here, I think, but it highlights some of the, if you like, mistakes that have been made managing our old precious trees over the last 30 odd years. And I just felt that it's important to share some of those mistakes that have been made in order that, you know, we ensure they don't happen again, I guess. And in the UK, when we'd been working with these old pollards, we were thinking about the ones that were out of cycle, and they were often 100 years out of cycle. But in Sweden, it was much less. It was probably 60, 40, 50 years out of cycle, but the trees were cut every 5 to 6 years, so it was a much shorter cycle. In the UK and in Spain, even in France, it's often a 10, 15, maybe even 20-year cycle with the cutting, and the species are different. So the thing that happened as well here in Sweden, as far as I've understood, is that it was this forestry thing whereby the meadows, it was the botany, it was the flowers that were really important. The trees were a part of it, but they were seen as a cultural history remnant. So all that was important was that they looked like lollipops. So that was the vision of the meadow, of the wooded meadow in Sweden, that you would, so they may have gone 50 years, but then they put in the forestry guys with their harvesters and they cut the tops off. So they basically topped all of these old pollards in almost every wooded meadow. Fortunately, there's some that didn't happen, but it was like, well, that's cultural history correct. You know, that's how they would have done it. And it's just like, no, there is not a single person historically that would have cut their pollard with a forest harvester for a start. And certainly not, you know, this size of branches. We'll see another site on Wednesday whereby there's the kind of the whole story in a more positive way, I think, spins out. This site has somewhere between, or had somewhere between 300 and 500 pollards over 7 hectares. So they were very, very dense, and they could be very dense because of the regular cycle. They didn't shade, they never shaded out the grassland in the same way. There's been some fabulous work done in Norway on the very steep slopes of the west coast that's shown when you've got pollards in a cycle in a wooded meadow, you have better productivity in the grassland because the roots are holding up the water, and you've got a constant recycling of the roots with the pollarding that's going on. So it's an incredibly important agro-silvo-pastoral system that in essence had been lost, I think, in Sweden because there weren't many people still doing it. So in 2004, I went on a pollard trip with Helen Reed that some of you know, and we couldn't speak a lot of Swedish, either of us, so we were trying to visit sites where there were people who were still cutting the trees regularly. And we also met with the forestry people, and we were so shocked to see that they were calling that pollarding, and that pollarding, and that pollarding. And for me, that word just shouldn't be used even in the same sentence when we're looking at these trees, that this is just topping. It's not pollarding. It's not thinking about the structure or the physiology or where the branches are, or, you know, and nothing about which trees have got the buds that will still produce. You know, there was nothing of that. And it was this dilemma that I think also in the UK we went through at the same time, whereby nature conservationists thought they were doing the right thing by recutting or topping pollards as it was, but actually not talking to people who work with trees, talking to foresters who work with forests and not arborists. And I think that was a real, I think, light bulb moment for many of us working with nature conservation, was also working with arborists and thinking about what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What are the consequences and what are the alternatives? There's still quite a conflict in Sweden over this kind of the cultural history aspect of the wooded meadows and how the trees should look versus how they're managed. This kind of lollipop look, and we'll see that particularly on Wednesday. I think you'll see the classic wooded meadow lollipop tree look of them. But what's interesting as well is that everybody talks in Sweden about how pollards were cut, that there's a standard method, that they were all cut at 2.5 meters height. All the material was removed every 5 years without exception. Well, when Helen and I talk to people and you look at the trees, it's like, I'm not sure I see any evidence for that, actually. And also you talk to the guy who's got the bill hook in his hand and say, how do you cut the tree? And he said, well, I do this, this and this. And if you like, I'll show you. And when he went up in the tree, he did it differently to how he described how he was doing it. So this was, you know, and I think this happens a lot in our, if you like, we have this idea, because we're very industrialized, that everything's done the same way. But actually, in this case, we were talking to people who said, well, I wouldn't do it like my neighbour because he does it wrong, because he's from that family and they never look after their trees properly. So there was nothing that was kind of set in stone, or how you did it or when you did it. They didn't all take all the branches all the time. Some of them left branches on, some of them didn't leave branches on, some of them did them in the winter, some of them did them in the autumn, some of them did them in the summer. So, but the important thing was having your winter fodder. So it wasn't the trees necessarily and how they looked. It was that you could do it when you had time and that you would have plenty of food for your animals to survive the winter. And all of a sudden, when you start thinking about that, the idea of topping trees where you massively reduce their physiological function, huge amounts of decay happen very quickly, particularly as the wooded meadow trees, ash was the crown, that was the best fodder, and then elm, and then lime, in that order. There were other tree species as well that were pollarded in the wooded meadows, but those were the three. And then we got ash dieback and we got Dutch elm disease, or Dutch elm disease came first. And here it's very slow in Sweden compared with continental Europe and the UK, the speed and the pace of Dutch elm disease. So, I mean, you can see there are actually elms that were alive until relatively recently here, which is definitely not the case in the UK, where, you know, I hardly even could recognise an elm when I moved to Sweden because they'd just all gone from the landscape. So I think then, you know, people thought, well, it's no problem. We've got ash and we've got lime, so that's fine. But now with, you know, ash dieback being a real issue. And that's the other reason I wanted to bring you here, because I think that I've done some work on just ash dieback to see the impact on old trees, because when it first came to Sweden, which was 2002, we were giving money to people to pollard their trees, and particularly ash trees. And I was really worried that if we're giving money for nature conservation for them to pollard their trees, what if that speeds up how quickly they die as a consequence of ash dieback? So I did a study in the West Country where we live. I had about 300 trees that I look at, some of which are old pollards that are not in a cycle. Some are in a cycle and some are not pollarded at all. And I've studied those trees since 2009, and the last time I went to visit them was in 2020. And what's really interesting is that these old trees are surviving much, much better than small, younger trees. And that added to that, the pollarding issue initially gave us the impression that when trees were cut regularly, they survived better. But I think it was, well, I know that the data was hiding the actual true story, which is that when the trees were cut regularly, you remove all the symptoms because you remove all the branches with the ash dieback. Very often, the first 2 or 3 years, they look fab, and then they die. So what we were seeing was, if you like, some of these pollards in a regular cycle were looking really, really healthy, 100%, and then the other half were looking really, really shit. So when you had the average, they looked okay. So I think we've now got a very clear set of guidelines for landowners, which they're not following here. So I've got some work to do when I get home. But I think that we've been really clear to help people what to do, because one of the issues also with ash is that they sometimes fall over. So I guess you've seen that with ash dieback in your various countries. The roots begin to decay once they really... But if the old trees are still alive, we're not seeing that happen quite as much. It's the younger trees that tend to be doing that. Now, there's several reasons why we've been in discussion with various different researchers about ash dieback and why we're seeing the pattern of the older trees looking a bit better. And there seems to be 3 things that we've picked up from our statistics and from some work in Denmark and some work in France and Belgium, which is that many of our old trees have probably regenerated naturally. So they have a genetic predisposition for where they're growing, their local provenance. They probably have a really good endophytic fauna or flora, in the system. You know, ash has lots of endophytes, fungal endophytes in them. And then the third thing, there's actually 4 things. They're often growing in the open. So we have these, for example, these types of environments. You've got the old pollards, they are often much more open. And the complexity of the tree itself. So both, you may have lots of functional units. You may also have, with these pollards, you've got all these gnarly bits. And the fungus itself doesn't do very well past branch unions. So it's not a good competitor, actually. So by having very complex crowns, which many of our old ash trees do, they're growing in favourable conditions for themselves. They're in more open, and you've got this endophyte system, which seems to be more developed in older trees than it is in younger trees. So it makes me optimistic about ash, although obviously, genetically speaking, 98% of them are likely to succumb. So we're just hoping that some of these kind of environmental factors can help them hang on a bit longer. But it's not helped when you're actually, topping them or actually even pollarding if they're showing signs of ash dieback. So our kind of guidance has been very simple to landowners, which is if you have a pollard in cycle which is showing no symptoms of ash dieback, carry on. If you have a pollard which is showing symptoms of ash dieback, and even if it's been cut on a regular cycle, don't carry on, because you will speed up its death. And then regard to pruning old ash pollards, so we may have ash pollards out of cycle, the same there. No pruning unless it's absolutely essential, so the tree would otherwise have to be felled or is likely to cause a problem risk-wise. Because by doing that, you increase the stress, and we see also that relationship between the increased ash dieback and stress, so via pruning in that case. So we've got a nice clear set of guidelines for landowners in order to be able to help them and keep more of our trees, because we had this kind of problem, if you like, with people's perception that with elm there was sanitation, that you should remove elm trees as soon as they show signs of the disease. And they were transferring that to ash dieback, which is a completely different vector, as you all know. So that was really why we felt it was so important to kind of go out to landowners. So in the West, in several of the counties, they've actually written to every landowner that has old ash pollards and sent them a little leaflet to say, this is how we would like you to be managing your ash trees in order that we can keep them as long as we can. The person who's been doing this has been thinking about what they're doing, because they're actually trying to maybe take the larger branches. I mean, I would have maybe taken some of these larger ones than that one there, perhaps. But there's been a discussion here about what's called dragare in Swedish, that you would leave one branch which continues the sap flow. But actually, when you understand tree physiology, it's a load of old rubbish. And you have to leave it all the way around if it's going to have any kind of function. So we've been talking about using the term a tutu, you know, like ballerinas. They have these skirts that go straight out, that when you're managing pollards, you need to ensure you've got trees with a tutu if you're going to ensure that they will carry on producing, and often below the cut point, so they're not shading the new buds and the shoots that are coming. But you know, some of the things that's been discussed when we talked to these old guys who were pollarding their trees was, you know, if you leave little stubs or not, you know, because that's a kind of the stubs in the arboricultural world. It's kind of swearing in church, isn't it? You know, that you don't leave stubs. Well, it's really interesting because they all said, oh, no, we don't leave any stubs. No, there's none of us that leave any stubs. Every single one that we saw them cutting were leaving stubs because it was really difficult. Came with their machines and just cut them off at what they thought was the right height. And sometimes the knuckles were left, sometimes they weren't. And they necessarily didn't always recognise it either. And I think that's the thing, because you've got a forester doing this work, and it's understandable that they're not necessarily going to have that understanding of what they're dealing with. And so you get huge amounts of decay in these big old pollards that have been cut in that way. And sometimes they survive, and if it's ash and lime, they quite often survived, and that's without ash tabac, of course. And then you're kind of left with something that's more difficult to manage, I think. And that's what you see with lime quite often, with hornbeam, where I used to work, that you see these kind of, the growth that's come back around this dead, decayed branch, it peels off when it gets too big. So you all of a sudden have to manage these trees often more regularly than you might have done before. And that's been one of the things that I think has started to shift, is that people are seeing the consequences of what this work did, but it takes 30 years. That's the trouble with trees, isn't it? Everything takes forever. That seeing that consequence, and actually that you could create potentially a more costly management problem than you would if perhaps you'd, instead of putting loads of resources into cutting this tree and reducing this tree, make new ones instead. You know, that's a much cheaper option.